So, hey, I'd like to welcome everyone tonight to the Sam Rice presentation. And I'd like to thank Kay for asking me to speak. When she first contacted me, I actually had to admit, I'm not really sure that I am maybe an actual Sam Rice expert by any means. I've grown up in Morocco. I wanted to talk to you guys about some different things that we've been involved in over the years to try to keep Sam's story and his legacy kind of going on. But I'll tell you guys, there is probably no more fantastic story about a baseball player or possibly someone in the world of sports than the story of Sam Rice. But before we get started on that, I want to kind of give some kudos to the real historical people and the historians and the authors that have put together some of this story about Sam Rice. Because really, he is a guy that has really slipped under the cracks. There's a lot that has really, there's not that much that has ever really been written about Sam. There's not that much that's been written about his life, what happened to him before he started playing baseball. But if it had not been for the Newton County historian, John J. Yost, none of this stuff may have ever really come out into the public. John is really the one that started researching a lot of this amazing story about what happened to Sam and his life and all of that. So we'll get into a little bit of that here shortly. But a couple other historians that I want to mention. I mean, I've been a baseball enthusiast since I've been a little kid, probably 8 years old, and I'll kind of get into the story about how I actually first found out about Sam Rice and his story. But you've got um, you've got John Yost, you've got Jeff Carroll, who, my knowledge, has written the only biography ever put out on Sam Rice. I've got a copy of the book up here in the visual presentation, and it's Sam Rice, the biography of a Washington Senators Hall of Fame baseball player. So Jeff Carroll has written a couple sports books, but he did a lot of meticulous research. And I would say anybody that really wants to get into some of the story that I might not cover of Sam Rice, you've got John Yost's Yost collections that are available at the Historical Society. That is a wealth of knowledge about this story. You've got Jeff Carroll's story, and then there are a couple other stories that are pretty fascinating too. So there is this organization in Major League Baseball, and it's called SABR, and it stands for the Society of American Baseball Research. And it's really a pretty cool organization. They put together all these baseball enthusiasts, and there are a lot of retired teachers, professors, historians, and they choose a lot of these, especially older baseball players. And they go through and they do, once again, a lot of meticulous research. So if you do a Google search on SABR, Society for American Baseball Research, there's an author named Stephen Abel that has put together a lot of really interesting facts and the story of Sam Rice on that as well. And then the other publication that I kind of want to touch on a little bit, and I've got it up here on display too. There was an author named Steve Wolf. It's WULF. He wrote a lot of sports stories for syndicated magazines. He did a lot of stuff for Sports Illustrated. But back in July of 1993, he wrote this story that was called Secrets of Sam. And once again, Google Steve Wolf and the Sports Illustrated story, Secrets of Sam. Fascinating, fascinating story. So back to when Kay asked me to talk. I tried to think, okay, there's quite a few people probably sitting in the audience that know a little bit about Sam Rice and his story. But once again, there are so many things that have never really been talked about, a lot of things that have not been made public and just never have made it out in print. And I think to really get the full effect of a story like this, you've got to think back around the early 1900s. You take nowadays, anybody that is a baseball player, anybody that has talent, pretty much everybody knows who these kids are. These kids are tracked from playing AAU ball to blue chip ball, high school ball, on to college ball. I mean, everybody knows who these guys are from the time some of them are 12 years old. But you got to talk about America back in 1912 when the tornado hit Newton County. I mean, it was a different world. I mean, look at, you know, the forms of news. I mean, the internet is now at our fingertips, gives us everything we want to look at. Just like all the things that I've talked to you guys about already on being able to Google search all this information or the information that is out there about Sam. But back in 1912, I mean, and we didn't hardly have cars even in Newton County, you know? And I mean, everybody was raised on a farm for the most part, and life was just a whole lot simpler situation than what we think about today. So, into the situation where I first became aware of Sam Rice, and I wanted to share this story with you guys too. There may be some people in the audience that know this guy. So, back in 1969, when I was a kid in 7th grade, one of my good friends was Jeff Manis. Jeff, obviously, you might know him from he was really involved in Everglades of the North, putting all that together. He's also the author of Salt, all the books that are down at the Historical Society. Well, Jeff was a little kid like me. He was just he just lived baseball. So we would talk about baseball all the time. And I remember the day that he came in 1969 and he said, "Tim, you won't believe this." He goes, "There's a new book came out and it's called the Baseball Encyclopedia. It's got every single baseball player from 1871 to 1969 that has appeared in a game, let alone played. Every single guy is in that." So, so him and I are scouring through that book. There's thousands and thousands of pages. Jeff actually was the one that showed me. He says, he goes, "Check this out." He said, "There was a Major League Baseball player from Morocco, Indiana, a guy that was born in Morocco, Indiana." So we started looking into this. And of course, in those days, once again, long before the internet or anything like that, we couldn't really find much information on Sam Rice. There he was, big and bold in the baseball encyclopedia, along with all these other players, but we didn't really know anything about him. So the first thing that you used to do when you were a little kid in those days, you could write to Major League Baseball teams and send a letter to an address at, you know, all these different cities, and supposedly you could get things back from signed baseball cards or report information or all this. Well, once again, I talk about Sam Rice falling through the cracks, and we'll talk about this a little bit. So we had to send a letter not to the Washington Senators. We had to send a letter to the Minnesota Twins. Now, I'll back up on this story just a little bit. A lot of people get confused about this. When Sam Rice first started playing Major League Baseball, he came up in 1915. Washington was actually called the Nationals, not the Senators. And the Washington Nationals were the official name of the American League Baseball team in the city of DC. And they were called the Senators, obviously, for, the political nickname and all of that. So the Washington Senators moved to Minnesota in 1961 as an expansion team. Everybody remembers 1961. That's the year that Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris hit all the home runs with the watered down pitching, right? With all the new teams. So anyway, long story short on that, we spent hours writing this letter to the Minnesota Twins. Never heard a word back on any of it. So anyway, that kind of shut us down a little bit on that. But I want to read one of my favorite quotes, and this is a word for word quote. When we started going through, because this whole story kind of has evolved from the time, like I told you, from when I was a little kid and discovered him and about him in 1969. I've luckily been involved in a lot of other things that we've done in Newton County, once again to keep his legacy kind of out there in front and things going on. So, back in the early 90s, Jeff Eisminger, who some of you may know as one of the officers of the Community State Bank in Brook, Jeff and I were working together in my dad's grocery business, and we decided, hey, wouldn't it be really cool to put up a picture of Sam Rice in a Welcome to Morocco situation? So we went out and we did some research and we did some things, and we actually ended up coming up with a local artist. Her name is Vivian DiBenedito, and she's from Lake Village. She designed the very first Morocco Sam Rice signs. And one of them was located out north of town, and then one of them was just at the railroad tracks on 114th when you came in. So I have a oil painting picture that Vivian so graciously did for Jeff and I back in the 90s when we first put that sign up. Well, over the years, that sign kind of got faded and kind of got bad. So then the town of Morocco, through Dalton Mangus, who was, a North Newton teacher, and Dalton actually did some newer signs that he put up. And some of those signs may be the ones that other people remember. There's one that used to be at the Betty Kessler Park. There were a couple other ones that were outside of Morocco and all that. So, but fast forward from the history of the signs, when I started my job as Newton County Economic Development Director back in 2015, I was contacted by the Indiana Historical Bureau, and they said, "Hey, listen, did you realize Newton County is one of just a handful of counties that does not have some state-approved historical markers in Newton County?" And so you guys probably remember, as the Historical Society way back, when I first came to you and I took it on as a goal to get up, a number of markers in Newton County. And so we partnered with the Historical Society and the State Historical Bureau, the town of Morocco, and Newton County Economic Development. And I'm really proud to say that we pulled that off. So our first approved historical marker is down at the Scott Lucas House, right on 114. I knew from the time that we picked our subjects, I had to lobby really hard, but I knew that Sam Rice one would be the first one that we did. So anyway, I kind of got off track a little bit, but that's my story on all the signs and the markers and all that. But I do want to read a quote, and it's a word for word thing. It's one of my favorite ones, and it is actually from John Yost. "They call him baseball's man of war because of his military service and because of his fleet-footed fielding and base running. He is arguably one of the greatest athletes to be born and reared in the Newton County area. The Beaver Township baseball field is named in his honor. His story is one of glory on the playing field, which earned him an eventual place in baseball's Hall of Fame. His story also colored is colored by sadness and linked to what is considered to be the greatest natural tragedy ever to occur in Newton County. So let me kind of go back now and we'll talk just a little bit. I kind of want to try to tell you guys some things maybe that you haven't heard. And this is all kind of probably general knowledge. But back in 1912, Sam Rice, who was born in 1890 on a farm near Morocco, started out. His name wasn't Sam Rice. His name was Charles Edgar Rice. Sam was a name that was given to him as a young baseball player because a sports writer could not remember his name. And he said, "Oh yeah, you know that new guy that the Senators called up, Sam." And a lot of people don't realize this either. Sam Rice started out as a pitcher. But here's where things kind of get murky. You noticed I said born on a farm near Morocco. So Sam Rice has a lot of connections to Illinois. And there are a lot of people in Illinois in the Watsika and the Iroquois and the Donovan area that also stake claim to Sam Rice. But when we did all this research and contacted the Hall of Fame, Morocco, Indiana is Sam Rice's official place of birth. His dad was a farmer. He did some tenant farming. He tried to own some of his own farms, and they moved around. So and once again, we're talking about back in 1912. I mean, if you grew up in Beaverville or Donovan and you were 2 blocks over in Illinois, you were pretty close to Morocco. But for all practical purposes and anything that I've ever read, he always gave Morocco as his place of birth. So, but Sam Rice, from everything that I've read on all the historical writings, went to school over in the Donovan and the Iroquois area. And back in 1908, he married a young girl from Iroquois, Illinois, and her name was Beulah Stamm. Sam and Beulah, which Sam worked at his dad's farm at that time, which was called the Guard Farm. If you would go west on 114 and just cross over at the state line, many of you are probably familiar with this. If you go down to the very first road that would turn left or turn back to the south, it's right, and you could eventually follow that road to Iroquois as well. But that is the road where the Beaver Cemetery or the Swede Cemetery, whatever you want to call it, is located. From everything that I've ever been able to put together, Sam Rice's dad's Guard Farm was right out there close to the cemetery. Okay. So like I said, he worked at his dad's farm, and then his wife, and they went on to eventually have 2 little kids. They had a son and a daughter, Bernie and Ethel. And in 1912, Bernie was 3 years old and Ethel was 18 months. So in April of 1912, Sam, who could not make the Watsika baseball team, signed, and there's a lot of stuff that's kind of different about this in history. He signed a contract not to actually play, but he signed a contract in order to go over and try out for a team that was called the Galesburg, Illinois Pavers. And they were in the Central Association. So in the beginning of April, Sam made the 150-mile trip to Galesburg from the Iroquois Watsika area. He left his wife, his 2 little kids with his parents, on the farm, and his parents were Charles and Louise Rice. And Sam also had three sisters. One was married and was raising her own family, but there were two younger sisters that actually lived with the parents on the farm. Their names were Bernadine and Genevieve, and they were 8 and 3.5. So picture all of this back in April. He takes this trip to try to make a baseball team. His family is staying with his parents, his two sisters, and his parents had a hired man or a helper at the farm that also stayed out there and worked with them. So anyway, I think this is the part that we probably all know. On on April 21st, 1912, the Rice entire family had gone by buggy ride from their house just outside of Indiana there close to Donovan to visit some of Beulah's friends and family that were living in Iroquois. So they were kind of headed back northeast from Iroquois, and it was about 6 o'clock at night. They pulled into the farmhouse, and the family members had all gone in, and Mr. Rice was tending to the horses. They were hit with one of the most devastating tornadoes that has ever hit, our area. And you guys can see the pictures up here. That tornado hit the Guard farm where the Rices lived, and by the time the devastation was over, everyone in that family was killed except for Sam Rice's father, Charles. When things calmed down, the neighbors all rushed to the farm, and they found Mr. Rice just wandering distractedly around the property. Nothing left. Houses, outbuildings, everything. All the bodies of the family had all been stripped of all their clothing. Mr. Rice had some severe injuries and everything too, but he was carrying one of his little girls in his arms. And she quickly, she didn't last very long. She passed away, rather quickly after that. So anyway, once again, go back to these days, and news is going to travel slow. He was actually up there that day playing a baseball game, trying to make this team. So like a day later, he gets a telegram, you've got to come back. There's been a devastating tragedy that involves your family. So it took him a little while to get back. And once he got back, he came back right at the time that the funeral was going on for his wife and two little kids. And if you guys ever want to see, if you go over to like where the current Iroquois Cafe is in Iroquois, and whatever that road is, it runs in between the Iroquois Cafe and like the animal shelter there. Take that road and go west, and there is an old church and cemetery that's called Prairie Dell Cemetery. Sam Rice's a wife, Beulah, and two little children are buried in a tiny, unassuming little marker out that's pretty hard to find out in that cemetery. So the next day, they had the funeral again for the rest of his family. Now, remember, his dad has not passed away yet, but his dad did end up dying on the 30th of April through his injuries that were incurred from the tornado. So literally, he's here from the middle of April, buries his entire family. Everybody that he loves, everybody that he's close to, he buries all of them. And the rest of his family is buried in the Beaver Cemetery. And this is one of the things that maybe people don't know, and I've always really sat there and tried to figure this out. They're buried in unmarked graves. His his mom and dad and two little sisters out there in that cemetery. So I've always sat there and speculated, why is that? You know, I mean, who knows? I really don't think that we can fathom what would be going on in somebody's mind, on a deal like that. So anyway, after his dad passes away, he leaves. I have never, ever been able to substantiate that he ever came back to Newton County after that. And here's where some of his life gets really, really, really even more kind of strange. So he took off, and you're talking about May. He went back and tried to make that baseball team up in Galesburg. And because he had missed, I guess nobody was really feeling really sorry for him. He got cut. So when he got cut at the beginning of May, and keep in mind, he was trying out as a right-handed pitcher. When he got cut, he just started wondering. And John Yost did a whole bunch of really cool research on this. And when he wondered all the way down to Louisville. He worked in a distillery in Louisville. He worked in the wheat fields of Dakota and Minnesota. He worked as a railroad section hand, and he drifted pretty much the rest of that 1912 year and all the way until about April of 1913. Well, he found himself out in Norfolk, Virginia. So what in those days did everybody do if you didn't have a plan? You joined the service. So he found himself in Norfolk, and he enlisted in the Navy. And he was assigned on the USS New Hampshire. Here's where stuff even gets even more weird. So you've got April 22nd, 1913, which is very, very close. It's almost one day to a couple years after the tornado. He's on this this battleship, and you've got the occupation of Veracruz in Mexico going on. And Sam Rice was one of the Navy shipmen that was on that boat. He's on that boat over in that battle in Mexico. 19 people get killed on that, at this. And, he continued after that to really start playing some serious ball. Because, like, even in those days, if you could play sports and you were in the service, you didn't do as much service work. You were put on a team, whether it was as a boxer or, a baseball player or whatever. So it was in the service when he really started getting some things to come together for his baseball career. So when he actually played winter ball at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. And that's where all these really big time service baseball teams used to train, was at our famous Guantanamo Bay now, right? So he played baseball there and really honed his craft. But remember, he's still a pitcher. So also back in those days, and I don't really know how this works, but if you were really good at doing something, somebody could buy your service contract out. And he came back to Petersburg, Virginia, and made a baseball team in Petersburg, Virginia, and started playing there. Well, that would have been in 1914. So when he was out in Petersburg, he was kind of discovered. They had a terrible team. And in those days, you had thousands of minor league teams that were all around, most of which didn't have any money or any financing. Well, the Petersburg team was about the same way. They were a really bad team, but they had this right-handed pitcher that was Edgar Charles Rice that was really good. So the Petersburg owner had a debt to Clark Griffith, who owned the Washington Nationals, AKA the Senators, and it was an $800 debt. Well, the owner didn't have the money to actually pay the debt off, but he says, "Hey, I'll one up that even better." He says, "I'll give you a player that is my best player, and he's gonna be really good." So Clark Griffith, the owner of the Washington team, laughed kind of about this, but it piqued his interest. So he took Sam Rice. Well, he brought him up and they tried to use him as a pitcher. He really was kind of struggling a little bit. This was in 1915, okay? But they did sign him to a contract with the Major League Washington club. So in August of 1915, Sam Rice made his debut as a Major League Baseball player against the Chicago White Sox. And he really didn't fare too good. He gave up a couple runs and he did some stuff. But he also had a base hit in that game. Clark Griffith started watching him and he said, "Hey, I think we've got some ideas for this kid, and I don't think they all involve being a right-handed pitcher." So he pitched a little bit in 1916, but then he started playing in the outfield too. And as I read Yost's quote, Sam Rice was a left-handed batter, a right-handed thrower, but he had blazing speed. And he started really doing well, and they started putting him in the outfield. Things are going really, really well for him now. He's starting to make a little bit of a name for himself and maybe actually get settled in Major League Baseball. Guess what? In 1917, he gets drafted into the Army. So now he's going back to the Army. So he was in the Army he missed the whole season of 1917, and he missed all but 7 games in 1918. But then by the time he got back, he really started clicking in 1919. And it's kind of a neat story because anybody that's sitting in the audience knows about that 1919 time in Major League Baseball. You were transitioning from what they called the dead ball era, which was when not many runs were scored, guys scuffed baseballs, and there was one guy in 1919 that changed that, Babe Ruth. And now everybody started hitting home runs and they were scoring runs and they were doing this. But Sam Rice's ball game, he was an old school player. Sam Rice did not hit home runs. Sam Rice stole bases. He hit for a high average. He got a lot of base hits. He was, once again, totally blazing in the outfield. And he went on through the 20s to play with the Nationals and the Senators. And anybody that does know baseball a little bit knows those Washington Senator teams in the teens were terrible. They had one player named Walter Johnson that was one of the best players arguably ever to play, or best pitchers arguably ever to play baseball. So, but they had a joke about the Washington team: first in war and first in peace and last in the American League. So obviously they weren't very good. But as they started getting these guys together and they started clicking and Sam Rice really started coming on, the Senators started getting pretty good in the 20s. So lo and behold, in 1924, the Senators win the American League pennant. And once again, you got to look at this. Baseball was a whole different breed in those days. You had 8 National League teams and you had 8 American League teams. For the most part, all those teams were original teams when baseball started in 1901. So, these guys were really not used to seeing the Senators be a really, really good team. And you still had a lot of these other teams now that are hitting home runs and doing all this stuff. Well, I've always felt like as great a baseball player as Sam Rice was, he didn't get the recognition and the kudos because he was almost playing from a bygone era of baseball. But needless to say, they made it to the World Series in 1924, and they won. They beat the New York Giants in a very exciting 7-game series. So the very next year, the Senators repeated in 1925. And once again, anybody that knows baseball, this was almost freaky that the Senators could put two trips to the World Series back to back because you had the Yankees right now. The Yankees were becoming the dynasty of Major League Baseball. But the Senators were a better team than the Yankees in 24 and 25. So the 1925 season starts in the World Series, and um, Sam Rice is involved in another really controversial situation. So the Washington team is playing the Pittsburgh Pirates, and it's the 5th game of the World Series. So it's back, what about October the 7th or 8th or something, October the 10th. And it's in the 7th inning of the 5th game. Sam Rice is playing right field. And the score is 4-3 with Washington leading. Pittsburgh has a power hitting catcher that comes up. And back in the days when baseball teams started playing in the World Series, they tried to maximize their revenues by putting temporary bleachers out into the outfield in front, like 20 or 30 or 40 feet in front of where the regular wall would be. So anyway, to make a long story short, obviously you have no ESPN, you have no coverage other than maybe some guy on the radio calling the game. Baseball's played in the daytime. This catcher hits a screaming line drive. Sam Rice turns around and runs what they said seemed to be like 100 feet because he was playing in really shallow, goes all the way back to these temporary bleachers. He hits the wall at full speed just as you see the ball go into his glove. The momentum of his race to the wall, he topples into the temporary stands. It's like they said 3, 4, 5 minutes. The umpires are running out there. Nobody comes up. All of a sudden, Sam Rice emerges from crowds that are trying to beat him and grab him and take the ball away from him, and he holds the ball up. The umpires call the batter out. Of course, Pittsburgh goes crazy. They play the game under protest, but the protest doesn't hold. The Senators win the game. So after the game, everybody is saying that is the greatest catch that was ever made. Did you catch the ball? And Sam Rice, being the guy that doesn't talk to hardly anybody and says hardly anything, just kind of says, well, the umpire said I did. And so the next day, he gets called into the baseball commissioner's office. Kennesaw Mountain Landis was the baseball commissioner. He said, Sam, there's been a lot of hubbub. He said, everything's all shook up. He said, I want you to tell me and tell me the truth. Did you catch that ball? Well, once again, he told him, he said, Judge, he said, the umpire said I caught it. And so Landis looks at him. He says, well, you know what? We're going to go with that. So anyway, crazy, crazy story about that. So the controversy still does not leave about that. Even though the Senators go on to lose that World Series in 7 games, everybody's talking about the catch. So Sam Rice says, I'm going to write this letter. And in this letter will be the whole story of whether I caught the catch or not, or whether I caught that ball. So the letter eventually, he kept it on his desk, I guess, for a long time. But back in the 60s, after Sam Rice was elected to the Hall of Fame, the letter makes its way to the Hall of Fame. But Sam Rice has given it to them, and he said, "Hey, this is not to be opened until I die." So I'm kind of skipping ahead a little bit. But after his death in 1974, the Hall of Fame starts looking for the letter. They can't find it. It's lost. But anyway, I won't bore you with the whole description of the letter, but they did find the letter. And actually in John Yost's book, you can read the whole story, and it's a pretty cool story. But he says in that story that he never did lose possession of the baseball. So fast forward way back when I started talking to you guys, I told you about that Steve Wolf that actually wrote the Sports Illustrated article back in the early 90s. And he wrote that Secrets of Sam. So one of the secrets that he talks about is obviously this letter and that story. But if you do once again a Google search on that article, Steve Wolf has a different spin to what actually happened on that, on Sam catching that ball. I won't spoil the whole story, but it's kind of a different story a little bit on that. But here also comes into the second secret that we'll talk about that's in that Sports Illustrated article too. So Sam Rice, like we talked about, and you can't really ever imagine what he thought, what he went through. Did he walk around his whole life just racked with guilt? You would have to almost believe, here I am away trying to make a baseball team, and had I been home with my family living in Watseka, maybe my wife and my 2 little kids would have been there, and it maybe still would have been a tragedy, but I wouldn't have lost my family. And I've sat there and I've thought about that so many times over all this stuff that I've researched and read about with him. Nobody will ever know because it's pretty well documented that he never, ever, ever talked publicly about the tornado and losing his family. Now let's fast forward a little bit on this too. So he didn't get married for a very, very long time after he lost his first family. So after he retired from baseball, he married a second time. Well, his second wife, he ended up outliving her, and then later he married a third woman. And there's a lot of people that don't know this, and it gets kind of sketchy, even in a lot of the history, because I've read this by some other researchers about the 3 marriages. John Yost has him being married only twice. So he has the middle wife left out of this. But anyway, back to the Sports Illustrated article. So supposedly when he was with his third wife one time, in a restaurant or something, somebody said something to him, "Do you care about speaking about the Indiana tragedy years ago?" And he made no public comment on it. Nobody ever knows what was said. Nobody ever knows if that was a follow-up conversation with his third wife and her daughter that was there. Nobody really knows anything about any of that. It is, I personally don't think he ever really talked to anyone about that. And there's kind of a cool part in that Jeff Carroll book about the biography of Sam Rice too. Sam Rice was best friends with Walter Johnson when they played baseball for Washington. And Walter Johnson lost a daughter to the influenza epidemic in like 1919 or 1920. And he also unexpectedly lost his wife. She died of heat stroke while at a baseball game. And so the speculation, which I think that is kind of my favorite part of the Jeff Carroll book, is can you really believe that as close as these two guys were in all these times that they sat around hotel rooms or on baseball fields or just talking or whatever, did they ever have a conversation about losing family members that you love or, something really close? But once again, none of that can be documented. So Sam Rice waited a really long time, and he still is going to have one record that will, I mean, a long time to get into the Hall of Fame. And he's going to have one record that will never, ever, ever be broken. And that is, he will probably, in the history of all of baseball, be the closest man to 3,000 hits that did not make it. So right now, um, basically, if you have 3,000 career hits, that's automatic inclusion into the Baseball Hall of Fame. I go back to when my buddy Jeff Manis and I were little kids and we had the baseball encyclopedia. 1969, there were only 8 baseball players in the history of baseball at that time that had 3,000 hits. Sam Rice ended his career with 2,987. He was 13 hits short. Now, baseball is one of those freaky sports that does not count postseason records or anything else with your regular records. Sam Rice also had 19 hits in the World Series. Had they done that like they do college or the NBA or different things like that, Sam Rice would have ended up with over 3,000 hits. But he didn't. So here's a good example, though. Now, anytime that someone gets close, they stay and they get their 3,000 hits. So I told you when I was a little kid in 69, there were 8 members. Today, there are 33 members in the baseball uh, uh, club that has 3,000 hits. So, but there's a lot of stuff that I'm still learning every once in a while, even though there's not a lot of stuff that's written about his life. And I just really wish that somebody would go out there. I mean, we see movies made on a lot less, right? I mean, how cool would it be if and I've tried to talk Jeff Manis into doing this, but I can't keep Jeff focused long enough to stay on that track, uh, going over to do that. But to me, just like I said, to quote John Yost, it is so many things happen to this guy, and for him to be from Morocco and Iroquois and Donovan and Watsika and all that is amazing. And just to put this in perspective right now, it took him a long time to make the Hall of Fame. He didn't get inducted until 1963. So he played his whole career for the Washington Senators from 1915 to 1933, and they released him in 33, but he ended up playing one more year part-time for the Cleveland, I hate to say Guardians, Cleveland Indians. And his buddy Walter Johnson was the manager of the 1934 Indians. So he gave Sam, they didn't know anything because people didn't pay attention to how many hits they had, but he brought him back and he played, and he did really, really well that year. He hit like 297 as a 45-year-old guy. And it was one of the few years that he did not have a 300 season batting average. But the thing that I also find so fascinating, and if you put this in this perspective, there have been in the history of baseball, and think about this, and you'll say that this is not true, but it is. It's totally true. Since modern baseball, or since baseball started in 1871 and then became modern baseball in 1901, all the way through 2025, there have been roughly only 21,000 Major League Baseball players to play this game. I mean, it's it's hard to make it, as a Major League Baseball player. Even then, even now, any of that stuff. And of those 21,000 baseball players, there are only 351 members of the Baseball Hall of Fame. Of those 351 baseball members, only 278 of those members are players. The rest of them are managers, umpires, executives, organizers, stuff like that. So once again, you think about some guy that grew up in Little Morocco and Illinois to be a Hall of Fame baseball player, one of 278, kind of blows my mind. And I really feel like he was shortchanged many years because of the type of baseball player he was. He wasn't a home run hitter. Once again, he got base hits. I mean, here's a good stat that I love to tell. He hit 34 home runs lifetime. 21 of those 34 home runs were inside the park. So that gives you the idea. He's a speedster. He stole 63 bases one year and led the league. He hit as high as 350 when he was playing in the 20s. I mean, he still is number 67 on the all-time list of baseball players with 498 career doubles. I mean, he was the major league leader in singles all the way till 1980 with 182. But it's a fascinating story, you guys, and I appreciate you listening to me. I get a chance to ramble a little bit. Kay said that, but a lot of really fascinating stuff with Sam Rice's life. So, thank you.